This is where a lot of PaaSes or SaaSes for a lot of organizations break down, is because they give you this onboarding experience at this super high level that lets you be extremely productive. But then eventually, once those companies, quote, graduate, then they're stuck, right? Then they're like, they can't do all the things that they might necessarily want it to do in those PaaS environments or SaaS environments.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Hacking Open Source Business Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Matt Yonkovit, the host here at Scarf, and I'm joined once again by my co-host, Avi Press. And today we're joined by Ben Hindman from D2iQ. Ben, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me here today, folks.
Yes. And so, Ben, you're one of the founders over at D2iQ, and D2iQ started off as the project behind Mesos. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep. The company started around the Apache Mesos project, originally called Mesosphere. Originally, we transitioned to the name D2iQ.
And so how did you come up with Mesos originally? Did you start using it at Twitter when you were at Twitter?
So we did, yeah. So the project actually started back at Berkeley when I was a PhD student at UC Berkeley. We were doing distributed systems research. And after putting out a research paper and chatting with a handful of people in the industry, in the community, a couple companies started to pick it up and use it. In anger is the term I like to use.
Okay.
Software only gets to production when it gets used in anger. And so a couple companies started to do that. Twitter was one of them. And ultimately I ended up working at Twitter for a number of years and helping Twitter to scale Mesos to massive scale.
And so how did it, tell us a little bit about how the open source project turns into a company. Like, at what point was that something that you were thinking that this has a lot of commercial applications kind of right out the gate? Was it Twitter that really, solidified this? How were you thinking about that very early on?
Yeah, I mean, I think Twitter and a couple of other early companies were a good indicator that there could be commercial value and commercial adoption of the open source tech. But when we were first building it, I don't think there was no motive to create it in order to create a business. And I think actually getting it in the hands of early adopters, seeing what those adopters could do with it, and being present at one of the companies gave myself and my co-founders the realization that it wasn't just these tech companies that could benefit from it. There was lots of other companies as well. And if we could actually get the tech into their hands, then they would benefit from it. And we could create a mutual relationship, which is a business between them and us. And it kind of came from there.
So I have a question for those who are listening. They may not be familiar with Mesos. Could you give us just maybe like a brief overview of what Mesos was?
Totally.
Yeah,
totally. So Mesos was one of the original container orchestration systems. And we identified pretty early on that, or we hypothesized, which I guess now in retrospect was an identification, we hypothesized that there'd be a transition in the industry from people deploying virtual machines to people wanting to run and deploy containers as well. And when you start to run all those containers, you need a smarter way of figuring out how to run them in your cloud or in your cluster. And so what do you need for that? You need an orchestrator. So, we were a pre-Docker, pre-containerization fad company that was doing orchestration originally of just things like, say, Java jars or Python wheels or, any other way that you might package up your container. And we were using containerization to isolate those applications that would be running on the same sets of machines, virtual or physical. And then eventually, the handshake was just give us a container, we'll run it, because the containers became prevalent and everyone started to use them. So that's what Mesos is. And the history was there was not very many companies that were doing this. Not really any. There was one company really that was doing anything with containers at massive scale, and that was Google. When we first came out with Mesos, and then when Docker came out as a company, Mesos and Docker were match made in heaven. They worked really great. And eventually Google came out and sort of announced to the world, oh, we've been doing containers as well. And we have a lot to thank Google for, because all of the containerization control groups, C groups, all the tech we got from Linux was heavily influenced and built by folks at Google. And then they came out with a project called Kubernetes, which is sort of the next gen containerization, container orchestration platform. Docker came out with Docker Swarm. Handful of other companies came out with their own. HashiCorp came out with,
Oh God, yeah, what is the one?
HashiCorp came out with not Nebula. Oh geez. Maybe we'll edit this part.
Yeah. Well, no.
Yeah.
No, you say there's a handful, but the different deviations or the different types of deployments of Kubernetes, there's just a lot, right? Or there has been in the past, right? Yeah. So people who have a derivative work that they've kind of built their own flavor of Kubernetes. I mean, it used to be a joke that there were more than grains on a beach, more Kubernetes distributions than grains on a beach, grains of sand on a beach. But, that is
Nomad. HashiCorp Nomad, that's what it was.
Oh, there you go.
A bunch of different container orchestrators. And really, I think the one that emerged within the industry as a standard was Kubernetes. And as you said, there's now, hundreds of different distributions, and that can be hard for people to weave through, but the underlying kind of core technology, container orchestration, is what everyone's after.
Now you started
go ahead.
at Mesosphere, obviously focused on Mesos, but D2iQ kind of pivoted and you're now doing more on the Kubernetes side. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. So when we started, Kubernetes didn't exist. We were trying to bring container orchestration to the masses. And we had massive adopters. We had Netflix was using it at massive scale. Twitter was using it at massive scale. Apple had come out publicly and they were using it at massive scale. PayPal, Uber. I mean, we had just, the who's who of Silicon Valley that was using the tech at a massive scale. And so we chose to then bring that to industry. And we did, we brought it to huge telcos like Verizon. We brought it to huge banks like JP Morgan Chase. We brought it to the definition of enterprise. And along the way, as the industry grew, it became clear that this was a very big tent, that it was not just going to be container orchestration companies playing a role. It was going to be security companies and networking companies and so many other companies that we'd be partnering with. And that kind of turned into the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the CNCF, of which I was, we were on the founding members and on the initial governing board, and then I held a seat on the technical advisory board for the first 3 years. And so part of that was just, we were living and breathing cloud native. We were living and breathing container orchestrations, all these things. We were building out APIs and, the modern standards with different partners and saying, hey, think about let's put these things together. It can work in Swarm. It can work in Mesos. It can work in Kubernetes. It can work in anything. So we were just really doing all these cross-cutting things. And that made us very plugged into all things that were Kubernetes. Eventually, it made us starting to contribute to the Kubernetes project, and in some places become significant contributors. And at some point, although it's a crude analogy, the analogy I like to give is, we were a car dealer and we were selling Jeep, and how many car dealers have you been to where on the left side of the car dealer they're selling Jeep, and on the right side of the car dealer they're selling Subaru or something, right? And and so that's what we did. We started also working with our customers on Kubernetes, and as Kubernetes has then become more of the standard in the industry, the company focuses more on that. But that's how it evolved.
So I guess I'm curious to hear early on how was the choice made to put Mesos in the ASF? I guess, the CNCF doesn't exist yet at that time. But can you talk a little bit about how, the different foundations that you were involved with were, I guess, how they were both contributing to this, how they were supporting the business? I'm really curious, like, why that one versus this one? Why start a new one? How were you generally thinking about your involvement with the foundations at this stage?
It's a great question. I think it's a key thing to consider for folks that are looking to create an open source business. And so as you said, Avi, CNCF didn't exist when we first put Mesos into Apache. And frankly, when CNCF first got created, there was a lot of contemplation about whether or not we would have taken Mesos out of Apache and went ahead and put it into CNCF. There was support from that from the CNCF side. There were a handful of folks that would have been interested in doing that. The idea with CNCF is that it wouldn't have been, the phrase we used to use was we didn't want to be kingmakers. And so if we could put two technologies of the same cloth into the foundation, then there would be choice. And of course, there was much debate about that, if that was really the right thing to be doing, or if that was pushing the choice down on consumers, which was going to make things even worse. Regardless, at the time, there was a lot of open questions. So I mean, if I rewind and I just go back to why Apache originally. There was a huge need from these various tech companies that I was mentioning for those companies to have the feeling of a neutral control and of protection for any contributions that potentially was going to be made back into the project. This is a pretty. It was a very standard thing over a decade ago when a lot of the projects were coming out of places like academia, but also out of different tech companies, as somebody would go and look for that neutral home where the tech could live.
Wait, let me just interrupt one sec. So
Sure.
what is the point of a neutral home in this case? Like, you're at this point, are you thinking about starting a business around this when this happens, or this is purely like you're a grad student and you're working on something?
This was early Twitter days. So
okay.
Twitter was becoming very involved, and lots of contributors, and some of the other companies as well were using and contributing. So the idea would be that, like, let's just pick a random company. Let's say Netflix wanted to feel like they would be able to make a contribution back to the project that could be accepted by the project ultimately upstream, so that they could use it themselves. The reality of a lot of open source projects is there's not a community around the open source project, and so companies have forks. They just fork the open source project, they do what they want to do with it, and then go from there. And the management overhead of that internally is really tough. And while it happens a lot, ideally you get the code upstreamed, you get that code being tested by numerous different people. You're not the only one finding your own bugs, and you're not the only one that's constantly trying to rebase your patches on top of however the open source is evolving. So that was some of the core concerns, and Apache it's one of the best foundations for this because the model of Apache is merit. So the idea in the Apache model is it's not who pays the most money, it's not who runs it at the greatest scale, it's who actually shows up and contributes to the project. And you can contribute in many ways. You can contribute by answering questions. You can contribute by writing documentation. You can contribute in a myriad of ways. And that merit that you get from contributing is ultimately what gives you the ability to make contributions back to the project. So for like a Netflix and an Apple and a Twitter and these companies who are not competing on this piece of technology, but are leveraging this piece of technology, Apache was a great fit for something like Mesos at the time. Pre-company, just tech companies using it, so forth and so on. So that's the history there. And then, you know, it changes a little bit when companies become involved. And I'm happy to share a little bit about that if that's interesting.
Well, that is very interesting because I think that anytime companies start to get involved, and as the project grows, the politics that go involved in governing an open source project that's as large as Mesos is, or as Kubernetes, or as any of some of the larger CNCF projects are, it becomes challenging. So what's your experience there?
Yeah, it does. And you know, to Apache's credit, I think Apache is sort of like, that's not our rodeo. That's not our playground. You know, our focus is on creating a place where people can bring projects, and there can be a meritocracy for those projects. And I think it's a great fit for that. A lot of businesses ultimately, they need, I'll call it the flexibility of having more control when it comes to the projects. And it can be very challenging to do that in an Apache organization. And I'll also be very frank about, I think that there's a real big challenge here, which is oftentimes open source companies that get created around open source tech, they bear a large burden to help get that piece of open source technology into the enterprise and into, you know, and the enterprise is massive. I mean, tech companies are massive, sure, but the enterprise is really where these technologies can oftentimes have their biggest impacts, because enterprise companies could not have rebuilt that technology themselves, whereas, you know, the Silicon Valley tech companies might have been able to. And so oftentimes the open source companies, they bear a lot of the burden to get that out there. And they don't always necessarily get to reap the rewards from that burden. And I think that's a big challenge, because the reality is if that open source project is going to continue and flourish and bloom, we need to be rewarding the open source businesses that are bearing the burden. And this is really where I think, in the Linux Foundation and the many foundations that they've helped create, including the CNCF, comes into play. You know, the model at the LF, the Linux Foundation, and the CNCF is much more focused on trying to help those open source businesses become as successful as possible, and in doing so, both helping enterprise in a huge way, but also, you know, making it so that the project doesn't potentially die because it can't reap the rewards of everything that it's doing. So the CNCF, I think, and the LF in general, I think that they've got a different perspective. That's not to say that you cannot build a successful open source company from the Apache Software Foundation. There's plenty of examples and counterexamples to my argument that it's more challenging. But it's a different perspective, which can lead to challenging things that that some people, you know, feel it's not worth it.
I guess to maybe give some advice for the entrepreneurs who are thinking about doing something like that, is there any tips that you would give to people to assess, should we donate this project to a foundation, or should we just keep it as a in-house open source project?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is well, okay, that's I guess there's two questions I can try to answer. One is the question of should I make an open source project or not? And then the other one, and then the other one is, if I make it open source, do I want to put it in the foundation? And what I tell most folks I chat with is, don't ask that question. Ask the question, what's going to be your business model? And kind of start and focus from the business model perspective with the open source, and then determine whether or not the putting in a foundation is the right strategy for your business model. And the first question, which is, to open source or not to open source, Also a very challenging question. And, you know, in my career thus far, to me, you know, in the open source world, there's really open source software, and then there's open source communities. And those are two very different things. And open source software is oftentimes source available, is a term that's used a lot more now. And open source communities are oftentimes more in a foundation, multiple contributors, meritocracy, or you know, or some kind of community in which there can be multiple winners within the community. And so that's, you know, that's another thing I think about. Again, you know, what's your goal in ultimately open sourcing it is because you want somebody to have source available, so that if you, for example, your company washes up, somebody can take the code, fork it, and do what they want? Or is it because you're trying to actually create a real community? And being intentional about that, I think, benefits all of us. I can't tell you how often we show up at a project that is open source, but you send a PR and they just get closed. You file tickets, they just get ignored. You know, that's not an open source community, that's open source. And I think being intentional to your users is great. Hey, this is source available. Don't expect us to respond to any issues or take your PRs, versus, hey, we want to bring you in.
And I think that the rise of just open source in terms of popularity has led to a lot of companies choosing open source from a marketing perspective, but have no desire to get into that community space, right? They don't necessarily want code contributions. They don't necessarily want PRs. And like you said, they get ignored. And I think that even some of that leads to some of the foundations even getting a little bloated. I always just am shocked when I look at the CNCF map of different technologies. It's so large, right? It's massive. And there's so many overlapping technologies. And, you know, I don't know if you have an opinion on, you know, kind of open source as a marketing gimmick. I mean, I do, but I'm interested in your thought on seeing that, if you've seen that as well, what you think of that as a trend.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is it's easy to see through a lot of those strategies, and it doesn't behoove you as a business. Oftentimes, you know, you might get some initial pop from it, but you might not get the sustained adoption growth revenue that you might have expected from it. You know, I personally, I think that we can be more explicit about what we're doing with open source. And I think to say, hey, this is source available. We're not creating a community, but we've decided to make it source available, can be a way for companies to check some of the boxes that they need to check for getting technology to be used at various places, without sort of bringing people along in this fantasy that they're going to be accepting their PRs and listening to their suggestions.
Yeah. I think they want a community. They just want a community of users, right? So they just don't want a community of contributors. Like, we want to control our own destiny.
Right.
And I know some companies are very, you know, persnippety about like what they accept because they want to control. I know I've had in the past where, you know, certain companies will rewrite any sort of code that you put out there so they can claim to own complete IP, you know, like provenance of it, right? So, you know, you might have submitted the code, but we completely rewrote it from scratch, so it's ours. That way, no one in the future can come along and do anything with it.
Yeah, what is even the point?
Well, you know, because it's the control, right? You know, because if in the future they might want to sell the company, and then they're, you know, it'll make it easier or whatever. I don't know. But I want to get back to something that you had mentioned from a company standpoint. You did pivot. You added, you know, Kubernetes, which, you know, it was parallel to Mesos, and that is a tough decision in my experience at any company to say, how are we going to pivot a little bit? How are we going to change what we're focused on? How are we going to add a new technology, or, you know, maybe look at some of those ancillary things? How was that internally for you all? Was that something that was a difficult decision, or was it just like obvious because, you know, look, you know, Kubernetes is so popular, it's so similar, we have to do it?
Yeah. Honestly, I think the difficult parts of it were resource based, more than what's the right word? Um, philosophically based.
Okay.
What we were already doing as a business before we even started distributing adding to that one of those 100 Kubernetes distributions was we had created a product that allowed you to run Kubernetes itself, in fact, many instances of Kubernetes in your cloud using Mesos. So, one of the early challenges of Kubernetes, and continues in some ways to this day, has been bringing up a cluster and managing it. And there was a lot of different perspectives out there of what was the best way to do it. Do you give every team their own Kubernetes cluster, or do you have a single Kubernetes cluster and you have multiple users on that cluster, or what? And we were helping to fill a void of the folks that said, I want to give everybody their own Kubernetes cluster. What's the best way of bringing that up as efficiently as possible? And at the time, bringing Kubernetes up on Kubernetes was extremely challenging, but because of the Mesos architecture, it was very easy to bring multiple Kubernetes. So we were doing that. And like I said, we had Kubernetes contributors, we had Kubernetes committers, we had all those folks. What we didn't have was the resources. As a startup, you don't have the resources to just say, oh, great, yeah, I'm going to sell two different things. I'm going to have mechanics for 100% two different things. Like, no, I get the mechanics for engines because Docker's the same in both of these environments, but a lot of the other pieces. And so that was one of the big challenges. But money talks, and eventually we were able to get the customers, and then it was sort of like, great, this makes sense. We can actually do this. So yeah, that's a little bit of the history that brought us there. And again, the industry was evolving, and that was probably the more challenging part for us. Probably the more challenging part for us was where to land in that conversation. Because it's this interesting moral, honestly, I think it's an interesting moral dilemma, which is, do I believe that the industry could be more productive if there was a singular way in which companies were doing container orchestration? I do. I feel strongly that on the flip side, I also think that some choice can lead to healthy debates and building and everything else. But yeah, I think that was probably the harder part for us. And when we show up with customers and they'd say, well, you tell us what to do. You guys are the container OGs. Like, should we use Kubernetes? Should we use Mesos? What should we do? That I think was the more challenging thing. And ours was kind of like, whichever you want, which wasn't necessarily a great answer. But eventually the industry continued to move in the direction of Kubernetes. And that I think is a whole podcast in itself, which is how open source technologies open source technologies ebb and flow, and the good parts about that and the bad parts about that. And yeah.
Oh, yes. I remember lots of technologies that were the it thing, but I don't know. Do you think, let me just throw this random out there. Is Kubernetes going to stand the test of time here, or are we going to replace it in another few years?
It's a great question. I think it's a really good question, and I think that it is the best contender right now to stand the test of time. And I think that personally, I think some of the evolution that we're going to see in the industry right now is going to be this sort of challenge between these high level of abstractions and those abstractions being able to be leaky enough that people can do anything and everything they want. This is where a lot of PaaSes or SaaSes for a lot of organizations break down, is because they give you this onboarding experience at this super high level that lets you be extremely productive. But then eventually, once those companies, quote, graduate, then they're stuck, right? Then they're like, they can't do all the things that they might necessarily want it to do in those PaaS environments or SaaS environments. And you want it to be some kind of a leaky abstraction where they can kind of be like, well, thanks for this really quick on-ramp, but now let me just go to the left of you, go to the right of you, whatever it is, and get everything else that I want. And I think Kubernetes provides something like that still is cloud independent. If someone gives you a SaaS that's leaky, but they say, oh yeah, you can bring up whatever you want in AWS, then you're stuck on AWS, right?
Well, and so we have seen that a lot of the cloud providers are pushing Kubernetes as well, right? But it's their brand, so there are slight nuances, between,
Very true.
Amazon, Microsoft, Google, right? Like there's little things, and to get software to work on all of them doesn't always work out of the box the same way, especially when you're talking stateful applications or a few other things. I'm an old database guy, right? So, I'm like, I'm more of the database nerd. So I think data and state. So there's quite a bit there on the infrastructure side that's challenging, right? Where it is, but you realize that as you move forward, just because it's open source or follows a sort of open standard doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy to move from one to the next.
Totally. I think it's an important call out. I think it's huge. The way I've always rationalized it with the organizations I've worked with and the customers is, even if you can't 100% just push a button and move it over, if it's like 70% easier, 60% easier, would I buy it? I'd buy it. And if I have that 60 or 70% that I can go back to my AWS the people that sold me the product, whatever their names are, and I can say, you're right, I can't move to Azure with one click, but because I'm on Kubernetes, it's going to be a 60% or 40% effort instead of a 60% effort. That's still leverage, and I would still take that. And at the end of the day, I still probably architect my application even just marginally more abstractly, but
yeah, that's the whole multi-cloud, right? Like effort. You hear some of that. It's not as prevalent as it was a couple of years ago, where everybody's talking about, we're going to go multi-cloud, because I think people just kind of assume Kubernetes is multi-cloud, so we'll just Kubernetes the crap out of that and be cloud native, right? We're just going to throw out a whole bunch of buzzwords and it's just going to work.
Yeah. No, I mean, unfortunately, I don't think there's any panaceas, and I don't know if there will be. But hopefully they're building blocks that are helping the industry go in a better direction. I'm an optimist. I'm always the optimist that we're making forward progress.
Well, Red Hat just announced that they made $1 billion on OpenShift, right?
Yeah.
So
that's huge.
So it is growing in this space. So your optimism's, showing some green blossoms for some company.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I think that the reality is that it's less for open source. I mean, Red Hat, saying they've made $1 billion is the argument for being able to have an open source business, right?
Right.
It's an open source business podcast, and that's the argument that you can do it. And then it's just like, what was the fairy dust that they somehow magically put out there to get them to be, $1 billion, whatever the announcement was, ARR or whatever, that's.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's the hats. That's it. It's just the hats.
I mean, I think that is the really important thing for us to maybe try to talk about a little bit, is like, what is Red Hat doing right in here? And I think, there's been a lot of discussions in the open source space around, whether it's relicensing things or whether it's open core versus, some other model. And here we have Red Hat just very quietly making $1 billion on a completely open source thing just by productizing it in a way that a very large company can do.
I think that's it. You just nailed it on the head. I think,
but that's not really that useful for most other companies, though, right? Like, Red Hat is huge, and so, I think the thing that I don't know is, what can a smaller company do when it comes to, we have this open source software, we're going to, just sell it, market it, support it, and package it so effectively that we become very successful. And I don't know, maybe there were analogs to this at D2iQ in the early days of all of those other business unit operations that really make something very profitable. Like, what were the really effective initiatives early on that were helping you monetize very effectively? Like, maybe there are similarities with Red Hat there.
Yeah, I mean, what Red Hat has is Red Hat created an engine pretty early on that if the Linux Foundation is the function of like name for foundation in and foundation out, like that's their product.
Yeah.
That's their function. I think Red Hat did a tremendously good job of both identifying, hypothesizing which open source projects were going to be have a huge impact in the enterprise, and then doing exactly what you said, Avi, which is making that happen for the enterprise, doing whatever they needed to do to make that be a consumable product in the enterprise. And you look at a bunch of different pieces of tech that in 9 out of 10 cases were not Red Hat projects. They were not new projects that Red Hat open source. They were Red Hat went and grabbed these things and said, oh, hey, I can turn this into something great. And that I think is a really important call out, because, Red Hat, to me, I don't know if any open source company would get funding for Red Hat's business model.
Right.
Not at all.
But it's a great, they've made it exceptionally effective and efficient. And they have no religion about which open source technologies. They have really good analysis, and then they pick ones that they believe are going to have that impact the enterprise, and then they make it so. I think a lot of companies, new open source companies, they say, I'm going to go and I'm going to do what Red Hat did. But when I hear that, I usually say, okay, so this is today's open source technology. What's tomorrow's? What's the next thing you're doing? What's 3 years from now? And a lot of companies say like, no, this is my open source technology. And I say, well, that's not Red Hat's business model. So you're not actually trying to be like Red Hat. You're thinking you're trying to be like Red Hat. And that's, again, where I think it comes back to what is the business model that you're actually really trying to create? Because I think you structure your business differently. If someone actually says, no, I truly do want to be a Red Hat, then I think, they think differently about how they're going to contribute to their current open source project versus how they're like, what's going to be in their roadmap next year for other open source projects you're going to bring in, so forth and so on. Unfortunately, there's also not a crazy amount of answers. Like it's sort of, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you don't open source, the likelihood that you're going to get adoption for a lot of tech is surprisingly low. And if you do open source, you have to figure out that fine line that you don't cross, so that you can be the place that everybody comes to get, whether it's support or extra features or a SaaS product for, or whatever it is. I don't have any direct answers other than I think these are the kinds of things that you just have to be very intentional and thoughtful about, and stick to your plan as you go about it, versus bouncing back and forth between different models. I think you got to come up with one, you got to stick to it, and you got to keep doing everything you can to get it to the place that is the best for the business, which I, again, firmly believe what's best for the business is what's best for the enterprise as well. As I was saying earlier, if businesses are doing well, I think that's a symbiotic relationship with the enterprises that are taking advantage of the tech, which is often sometimes lost as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think overall, just focus is very, very essential for startups, kind of pretty much in any domain. That's fairly evergreen advice, but it also does apply to the open source strategy as well.
Yeah. Avi, one thing I wanted to mention about the Red Hat thing that I think that a lot of people dismiss, especially Ben, when you said we're going to follow the Red Hat model. A lot of people say that. I've heard it many, many times. Yeah. The thing that people don't realize is it's so much easier to sell to companies you already have an existing relationship with.
Yep.
And Red Hat is in so many enterprises just from Linux. They got in so early, and they're so prevalent. it's very easy to overlook that already established connection and the power of that kind of ecosystem that they can just go tap into. And I know several years ago, and I've had conversations, I know some people in sales and, partnerships at Red Hat, and they've said, years ago, it was for the next 5 years, our 5-year strategy is every customer of Linux, every customer of any Red Hat product is going to hear about OpenStack. And then it changed to OpenShift, right? So it was OpenStack, and I guess that didn't go as well. So then they shifted to OpenShift. But that power of being able to actually tap into the customer base and talk to them about other needs and being able to build on top of what you already have, I think it's often overlooked, especially when people look at, we're just going to be the next Red Hat.
I mean, you kind of just have it's a very similar thing, just like how many times at bat do you have to, find the successful business, and now Red Hat has the space where they can just, they have as many at bats as they want to take, which is very good for them.
And not just Red Hat space, it's all of IBM space. It's huge.
Yes,
oh,
IBM, multiplied it.
IBM.
Although we'll see what IBM continues to do to Red Hat. That's a whole weird thing, right? Let's not get into that. We could go into a rabbit hole there for a while, right?
So I guess speaking of at-bats, Ben, I know that you are working on something new. I don't know if you care to talk about that here at all, but I'm very curious to hear about how that is going.
Yeah. I mean, so when we first entered this space, 2009 was when we created Mesos. 2009? 2008, 2009, I think. 2008 or 2009. I can't remember the very first paper that we wrote. But when we did that, one of our fundamental goals at the time was to make it just easier for people to build distributed apps. As much as orchestration was, the thing that emerged that everybody wanted to do, and it's a kind of building of distributed apps. Our goal was to make it so that you were not just building the software the way you did in the 90s, but now running it on a cloud, that you were fundamentally writing software for this different form factor, where the form factor was now a cloud or a cluster. And not a single computer or your laptop. So the TLDR is I'm still at that still thinking about that exact problem, and if there's certain higher levels of abstraction we might be able to provide in the distributed systems space that would make it easier for people to build future distributed systems, and run from day one on the cloud versus run them for your computer and then deploy them someplace else. So that's kind of the TLDR. I guess, once a problem in someone's head, always a problem in someone's head, not necessarily each iteration, not clear if it's fixed it or not, or just, added more problems to go back and tackle again. But, it's a lot of fun. And I come back to the question of open source all the time. And rethinking what's the right strategy and trying to apply the things that I've taken. And I still firmly believe in open source and think that, you need to be very, just to repeat myself over and over, you just need to be very thoughtful about your business model, but that the reality is you probably do want to put something out there open source and be thoughtful about intentionally what that means, if it's open source or open community. And I'm trying to eat my own dog food and live my own advice.
I guess besides for this, the intentionality behind that business model, if you're assessing, am I going to open source this new project? Am I not going to do that? Are there any other particular experiences from past Ben that are now most relevant to this project?
Yeah, I mean, so many, but for this project, past experiences that are really relevant. I think that past Ben, past Ben sounds like a movie or something like that, a character from something. I think there's a healthy place for really when you're building something new. I think there's a healthy place for understanding what the industry is doing now and where the industry might go. Some people talk about like skating to where the puck's going to be or something like that. And I think that that's also a relevant thing to think about, especially in the open source space, because there's a lot of open source projects that get put out that are pretty focused on the here and now, and not necessarily focused on, okay, solving perhaps a problem in the here and now, but maybe trying to do it in a way that is going to have a little bit more legs for where things are going. And I say that because in my past Ben, you're so focused on what's happening right now. Sometimes you just don't stop and sort of re-ask those questions about like, hey, well, that's happening right now. Well, where's it going and what's happening? And I think that sort of reflection and exercise is a really, really useful one that I find myself doing way more than I did in the past. In the past, it was way more just like, we got to solve this problem. How are we going to get containers to do networking? Go. And less like, should containers do networking? Like, what will containers do in the future when it comes to and that was a poor example, but I think it's an interesting one. Remind folks to take steps back and think about where we're going versus just in the here and now.
Sometimes hard to do in the chaos of a startup, but very good advice. Nevertheless,
so hard to do.
You know what, Avi? You know what? Oh, you know what time it is?
What time
Rapid
is it?
fire question time. Ben. Oh, it says it's 3:53 p.m. My watch just went off. So, Ben, we like to finish our podcast with rapid fire questions where we'll ask you, 11, 12, 30, 40, 50 questions. We don't even know how many questions we're going to ask. We're just going to go. And we just want like top of your mind, what comes to mind type of answers. And if you need a second to think about it, that's okay. But we hope you're game for this.
All right.
Because we're going to ask the questions and it will be really awkward if you don't answer.
Who am I playing for?
You're playing for Avi's dog. Avi, we're going to play for Avi's dog. All right. So what is your favorite open source project right now? Not one of yours, but the favorite open source project that you really like or admire or use quite a bit right now.
Favorite open source project. All right. This is a controversial one. Yes. But I'm going to throw it out there. It's Bazel.
Oh, excellent. Love that.
Okay.
Is there going to be a follow-up to that? Like, why is it both favorite and controversial?
Well, you feel free. Yes, tell us. It's rapid fire, so just tell us.
I think that the idea of what it's trying to solve, hermetic builds, is an extremely notable thing that I believe would make the industry a far better place. Do I know if they nailed it on the head with their implementation? Not so much. Do I think that they're killing it when it comes to onboarding new folks and great documentation? Not so much as an open source project, but do I think that it's a very powerful project? Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Nice.
Okay. What editor are you using?
Oof. I still use Emacs, so it's poor
Good
fingers. But I use a lot of VS Code. But
Avi's an Emacs fan, so I use VI.
Space Max though, so I appreciate both.
All right. And Ben, I understand you go skiing quite a bit. Where's your favorite place to go skiing?
Palisades, Tahoe.
Tahoe. Okay. All right. Most recommended book. What book have you recommended the most?
I love Creativity Inc.
Okay.
Ed Catmull talking about the creation of Pixar and the culture that he and his team created that produced, amazing number of exceptionally good children's adult movies.
You've recommended this to me too, so this checks out.
Oh,
this answer checks out.
There you go.
Okay.
It's a quick read. It's an enjoyable read, and I think it's got some really interesting management culture business ideas.
Okay. You're going to sit down and write something new. What programming language are you going to choose?
I mean, I still believe in the right tool for the job. And because of the kind of stuff that I do, it's very full stack, trying to enable people to build, future distributed applications. So that's a tough one to answer, but the two languages that I see used in the biggest overlap in all the places is Python, data science, backends, a lot of web stuff, as well as TypeScript, JavaScript. And, as someone who went to graduate school to study programming languages, I don't love that answer.
It's two interpreted languages, right? So, that's interesting.
I do not love that answer, but as someone who's also trying to think about open source, you want to get contributors, you want to get everybody else, what language would I prefer to write all my code in? Probably Haskell.
Yeah. Whoa, Avi's like all happy about that. All right.
Wow.
We need to move on from that before.
What a great answer.
Yeah. All right. So what phone are you rocking now? What phone are you?
Still a very old iPhone. I've got I don't even know what version this thing is, but
okay, but you're an iPhone guy.
So I got an iPhone. Yeah.
All right, fair enough. Yeah. You're going to have to pick a theme song to enter to a conference talk or something. What's your theme song?
What's my theme song? All right. Wow, the first thing that comes to mind, that's like really bad. I mean, the first thing that literally came to mind was the final countdown.
Oh, well, okay. Hey, why not? Why not?
Love it.
We're going to put together a playlist for the podcast with all the people who answer this. Okay, so first Linux distribution.
My first Linux distribution was Debian. Oh, geez, what version was it? That's a good question.
An old version of Debian.
A very old version of Debian. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. When I was still on a dial-up, and I used to go to the library and print out the man pages and read them at home, and those were the days.
So, but this could date you, I guess, if I say like, did you have to put it on floppies or a USB stick or a zip drive, or like what media did you have to download it to?
I downloaded it to a zip. I'm pretty sure I downloaded to a zip drive, like one of the old blocky like purple ones. That's what I.
Oh yeah,
that's what I remember doing.
Okay, yeah. I'm a little older, I guess, because I remember the floppies. But I also did a zip drive as well over the years. A lot of different media, but that really tells you where that version is, depending on what media you had to install from, right?
That brings me back too. I appreciate that.
So curious, when you're talking about open source adoption, what is the metric that you look at to gauge open source adoption?
Not GitHub stars.
We like that answer here.
I would say the metric that I look at, pre-COVID, I found that conferences were a surprisingly good metric for what was happening in your user community. They showed. So I think meetups are a great one as well. I think you can get a lot from who's coming to meetups, what's happening. But conferences, they show a commitment that is fiscal and time, and that people actually can get some value out of it. So very much from like a user community, but also from a contributor community. Contributors, I think we love to get together with one another and share things and talk, and so I think it's, for me, like I'll sometimes hear about an open source project and I'm like, oh, I haven't heard much about it. And then I'll sign up for the conference and like 11,000 people showed up and I'll be like, what? Holy cow. Like,
yeah, that's a level of commitment, right?
It's post-COVID, it's a little different because a lot of conferences were just like, hey, free passes, you can join our live stream. And it's a little harder to gauge. Are there lurkers or are there true committed users. But pre-COVID, I thought it was a good metric.
All right.
Perhaps not the most obvious answer, but
no, hey, that's cool, right? We want to hear the eclectic ones too. So, if you were going to choose a superpower to have, what would it be?
Superpower to have. Wow. First thing that comes to my head. That's what I got to answer, huh? Probably. Well, it's really tough. I don't know what I would choose to have.
That's okay.
That's okay.
This is what I choose. No, I have a good one. My superpower would be something that, given multiple choices in front of me, I could select that choice extremely quickly, which is very meta because I have many choices in my head right now, and I have a hard time picking one. So, and I'm a Libra, and I have historically always been told by everybody that my decision making is rigorous, but can be long, and so I would help me get to my answers quicker.
Ben, I want to thank you for doing rapid fire mode. I want to thank you for coming to the podcast. I really appreciate your time. We do love that you stopped by to chat with us about this stuff.
We're very happy to be here. Thanks so much for including me.
All right. Until next time, everyone, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us. We do appreciate it. See you later.